This is the Voice of Early Childhood podcast. Hello everyone, welcome to the Voice of Early Childhood podcast. My name is Angelica. I'm your host today, and I'm joined by Gemma Goldenberg, who's a PhD researcher. Thank you very much, Gemma, for coming on to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So today we're going to be discussing your research, or kind of giving it a bit of an introduction on this episode, and really looking at like the science behind outdoor play, and specifically your research of how indoor and outdoor environments affect children's stress, attention, and self-regulated behaviour. So I just wanted to start by saying that we've got quite a shared mission between us to really focus on making knowledge and research more accessible, and that is exactly what we really need to try and do more of in early years, and my aim with the Voice of Early Childhood is really to bridge that gap between academia and practice, so really ensuring that the research that we do, or people like you do, reaches practice a lot quicker, and is a lot more accessible to educators than what it normally is, and also more accessible to families. So there's a few ways in which you talk about in your article in terms of making it more accessible to parents and educators. Did you want to just tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. So that's always been a really important part of my research, because before I was a researcher, I worked as a teacher in schools, and I tried to use research in my practice, but I found it really frustrating that accessing that research was really difficult. So often what I was reading were other people's summaries of research, and those weren't always accurate reflections of the results. And then when I tried to actually go into the original research papers, either they're sitting behind a paywall and, I don't want to be paid £30 or £40 to download a paper, or even if the paper's free to access, it was so complicated to read through, but without a kind of background in statistical methods or, methods, I just couldn't really make head nor tail of it. So when I decided to kind of leave teaching and do my own research, it was always really important to me that I communicated that research in places where parents and teachers could find it and they wouldn't have to pay, and it would be easy to understand. So not full of jargon, not including lots of kind of statistical analysis without explaining exactly what that means. So that's why I tend to kind of write things for magazines, come on podcasts, and then I've also set up my Instagram account at PhD in 3, which is where I try and share not just my own research, but other research that I have read along the way through doing my PhD. Just share kind of really concise summaries of the research, and always talking about what that means for practice. Like, how can you actually put that into practice as a parent or as a teacher? Kind of practical tips, but also things to look out for when you're looking at research, because I find that on social media, people tend to just cherry pick quotes or findings. They often don't even say which research paper they come from, so you can't follow it up and check, that citation. And a lot of the nuance is missed. I think this is the problem with social media. You never have very many words to do your post or very many slides. Yeah. And I think it's really important that if you're going to use research on social media, that you point out some of the limitations of that research. So in my posts on Instagram, I always talk about looking at the sample size. So don't go and change your practice based on a study that was only done with 5 children, because it's not necessarily going to work with the children that you've got if it's a different context. And looking at things like, if the results were statistically significant, which is an indicator to show that they're not just down to chance, and that they're likely to kind of hold true across different contexts.
So it's really about being critical about everything that you read, especially on social media.
Yeah, exactly. And I think there's a lot more kind of encouragement and expectation now for practitioners to be research informed, but there's not necessarily that guidance and training out there about how to do that. And sometimes I think people misinterpret that, and they are very quick to take a piece of research and say, oh, this is the right way to do it, so I'm going to change what I was doing and do this instead. And actually, when you dig down into some of those research studies, they might have been done in a completely different context, and especially with a lot of the cognitive science research that came out, a lot of that was done and a researcher, and that's very, very different to putting something into practice if you've got 30 children in a classroom or in a nursery setting. So that's why as well, when I did my research, I wanted it to happen in schools, in classrooms, with the teacher or the adult that the children would normally be with, not me coming in and doing something completely different. I really wanted it to be as naturalistic as possible. And so I made sure that I worked with teachers when I was planning the research design, because I wanted the research findings to be as useful as they could be.
So it's important that we not only look at the findings and that being something that is a focus, but actually the fact that they can be accessed and shared, just like we were saying. But I guess the question is, why isn't research influencing policy and practice enough in terms of, why aren't we seeing the effects of it more widely? Why isn't, I guess, government translating it for us, or other places? It's not just about parents and educators accessing the journals. It's about the research being widely informed and informing practice.
I think we are seeing more of that across the education sector as a whole, but in this particular area, what I'll be talking about today with outdoor learning environments and how they kind of affect children and can influence practice. I think a lot of the research in that particular area has been rated as quite poor in terms of its methodology. So things like the measures that have been used aren't consistent across all different studies. So if someone does a study of outdoor learning and they measure children's attention and they use a particular type of attention test, and then another piece of research also looks at the impact of being outdoors on attention, but they use a completely different kind of attention test, then we're not building on what's happened before. So it's really hard to kind of build a really strong case and say, we've got this data that supports this, because people are using all different measures. And that's something that's really true in the field of outdoor learning. So across that field, there's maybe 20 or 30 different measures used for things like children's well-being or their attention or their behaviour. So it's really hard to pull together the results of those studies and come up with a conclusion. There's also a lack of experimental studies. So a lot of studies don't have control groups, for example. So they might say, we did this 10-week course of forest school and it had this amazing effect on children, and they were more confident and they were more articulate and they were physically fitter, for example. But if they're not comparing that with a group of children that didn't do the forest school experience, we can never be sure that impact was forest school. It might just be that as children become older, they are going to be more articulate, for example, if the research has taken place over 6 months or a year. So this is the kind of thing that people use to judge the quality of the methodology of the research. And in reviews that have done that, it's come out that in general, the methodology is poor. So policymakers, for example, aren't going to use that kind of research to make big changes. What I'd love to see is policymakers saying, all children need to be entitled to time outdoors and they should be spending a minimum, number of hours outdoors. But that's not going to happen until we've got really robust scientific data that policymakers are going to feel confident to make those kind of decisions based on. Because qualitative research is great and I think we can learn a lot from it, but we can't use it to make big generalizations and make big decisions about, educational provision for all children.
Yeah, I guess qualitative data is a lot more specific to different contexts and really looking at a lot deeper. And like you say, quantitative is more about volume, isn't it? And that's when in your article you talk about that's when decisions can be made about investing money, and that's what the government are really looking at. And when we want to have more investment in outdoor learning, then that's when we need research which will support that. So I guess it's almost conducting the research in order to get a specific outcome, but not necessarily because you may believe that that is exactly kind of the best way of conducting it, or maybe that's exactly what you want to do. So I guess sometimes it's really choosing methods in accordance with what you want to get out of the research in the end in terms of the effects that it has. rather than just the findings and that being it, and we find something out and we don't really do much with it?
Yeah, it's a balancing act. So obviously I've kind of got in my mind where I'd like this research to go and the influence I'd like it to have, but I also can't be biased. You have to be really careful as a researcher, not just finding what you wanted to see. You have to be scientific about that. Maybe the research would have come out to say that outdoor learning isn't important at all, and I have to report that and be honest about that. It can be very tempting to run certain analyses just to find the results that you want to find, so you have to be careful with that. And then when you're thinking about the kind of research you want to do, obviously the most scientific and sort of easy to control research does happen in a lab, because in school settings there are all these different variables that you can't control, and things are different every day, and that's a difficult context to do research in. So if I wanted to be really kind of tight and regimented about it, I would be doing this study in a lab and set up an indoor lab classroom and an outdoor lab classroom, and make it all very kind of accurate in terms of how the experiment was run. But then, as I said earlier, that's not necessarily as useful to teach. They want to see research that's been done in their own context. So it's about finding that balance of I wanted to choose measures that were scientific and that were very objective, but I wanted to do it in a very kind of natural way, so that children weren't being pulled out of class to do an attention test indoors and an attention test outdoors. I wanted the activities they were doing to reflect what children would be doing in any reception class.
So in terms of, talking about the methodology now, what methods did you use?
So the way the study was set up was that I worked in various schools across East London, and I went into the reception classes of the schools and ran a series of sessions that were indoors in their usual classroom or outdoors in whatever outdoor space they had at the school. So it was quite important to me that we didn't go and do forest school, for example, because not all schools have access to that. So I wanted to try and show what's the impact of just using whatever outdoor space
you've got.
If that's a concrete playground, next to a main road. So I ran 8 indoor sessions and 8 outdoor sessions with every class of children. And each session was a carpet time session. So either the teacher would read a story or do a maths activity, and that lasted about 5 or 10 minutes. So the children were just seated during that time, and it was teacher led. And then after that, they did 30 minutes of choosing time, which was kind of free flow, and the teachers would set up a range of like tabletop or floor activities, so things like Play-Doh, painting, construction, phonics activities, whatever they would normally have done. I didn't kind of interfere with that at all. And the children spent 30 minutes just kind of flowing around, picking and choosing their activities. And then what I did to kind of measure the impact that it had, whether they were indoors in the classroom or doing those things outside, is the children wore an ECG monitor, so it was monitoring their heart rate throughout the session, and they wore a head-mounted camera and a microphone. So from the camera footage, I could see which activities did they choose, how long did they spend at each activity. I can hear the conversations that they're having with their peers through the microphone. And then they also wore an actigraph, which measures movement. So it's a bit different to a pedometer, sorry. It's different to a pedometer because it doesn't count the amount of steps they do, but it can tell where children are in space and how they accelerate through that space. So it can tell whether the children are sitting down or standing up, are they laying down, are they jumping up and down. So it can tell you about the type of movement they're doing and the speed of that movement. And the main thing I used that for was looking at the total amount of movement each child did. So were they moving around more indoors or outside? And then I've just started to do some more fine-grained analysis of the types of movement they're doing. So you can tell from that, are they doing sort of fidgeting, or are they doing big gross motor movements like running around and so on. So I kind of gathered all of that data and then compared indoors and outdoors for each child.
So in terms of so you said they do 8 sessions, so did 8 sessions. Is that 8 sessions indoors and outdoors, did you say?
8 in and 8 out, so 16 in total.
And when they did the free flow activities after the adult-led activity, were they able to choose to go outdoors as well, or were they just indoors and that was that session, and then you did a separate session outdoors.
Yeah, exactly. So whereas in most settings that I went into, the children had a choice of whether they were going to be indoors or outdoors, and it was quite free flow. For the purposes of the experiment, we had to say this is an indoor session and everybody's indoors for the whole session, or it's an outdoor session and everybody's outdoors. Because the problem was, if I let them choose for each kind of data collection session, I could have had a different mix of children.
Yeah.
That could have influenced the result. You know, maybe children behave differently when they're around certain other children. I should have said as well earlier, I also measured the noise levels for each session. So, you know, if on that day 20 children are chosen to be indoors, that would have been a much noisier session than if only 5 children had chosen to be indoors. So that was one of few things that I did have to interfere with a bit because of controlling it to make it work in terms of comparison to the experiment.
So when they had the outdoor sessions, did you say that they had exactly the same activities? So they would have an adult-led story or maths activity outdoors as well?
Yeah, exactly. So everything was matched indoors and outdoors, because that's another problem with some existing research. It tries to compare, you know, indoor learning with something like forest school. Well, with forest school, it's not just the setting you're in that's different. The whole pedagogy is different. You're going to do completely different
all the activities,
different resources. So how do we know what's due to being in the forest and what's due to that different style of teaching? So every activity that they had was logged. So if they'd had construction inside for a session, they'd have also had construction outside for a session. And even with the stories, the stories that the teachers read were from a specific series of stories that I provided. So I could make sure the stories were a similar length and a similar level of difficulty. Because again, otherwise, you know, I might be saying, oh, the children paid better attention indoors, but actually it's just because they had an easier story indoors outside, or a shorter story, for example. So all of those things I had to be really careful about, you know, matching and counterbalancing, because I'm really trying to just pull out the impact of the indoor or the outdoor environment. So to do that, I have to try and keep all those other variables the same as far as possible.
Especially when you are focusing on the quantitative methods, where there's those specific kind of wearable devices that you explained that are measuring kind of children's different aspects, you know, like you mentioned, heart rate and things like that. But things like trying to, I guess, look at their movements. So you could really observe that for a qualitative method. But then that's when, like you said earlier, when there's that kind of difficulty between, is this subjective or is it more subjective? Because the observations are a lot more subjective and it is what you see, and you may judge children to be moving a lot more than someone else may do that because they're comparing to different kind of contexts or different children that they've seen before. Whereas with the actograph, it is a lot more quantitative, isn't it? It's providing you with numbers and data rather than what you deem the child to be, how you deem the child to be moving and how active they are, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. So when we're just making those judgments ourselves from an observation, even if you have kind of a certain scale, you're going a rating scale or something like that, it's really hard to not see what you want to see or what you expect to see instead of what's actually there. And also, you know, if you've got 30 children in a class, you can't observe 30 children at once in a 30-minute session. So I'd have had to divide up the time and spend maybe 1 minute observing each child. But how a child's moving around for that 1 minute doesn't necessarily represent how they are across the whole session. So that's why I tried to use that, you know, this equipment and these kind of more objective measures, so I could get a lot more data. And also that data isn't going to be biased. You know, it's being recorded by a machine and not by me.
And in terms of in your title, you're looking at self-regulated behaviour. Would there be an element of subjectivity there when you're looking at your data and trying to understand, whether children are regulating, or how much they're regulating their behaviour?
Yeah, so that was probably the most subjective of the measures. It was really, you know, in the process of designing the research, this was one of the things that I struggled with the most. How am I going to look at self-regulation? So some people do use heart rate to look at self-regulation, because you can look at things like when a child's heart rate really increases because they've had an argument maybe with another child, how quickly does the heart rate return back to its kind of average level? So you can use that kind of scientific, you know, heart rate data to look at that, although I haven't done those analyses yet. What I did was mainly use the video data. So I went back and watched the video data. I did 4 5-minute segments for each child, and then logged every incident of pro-social or antisocial behaviour. So it wasn't just me that kind of coded it. I had quite a lot of different people helping to code the video data. And we had like a drop-down menu of all the different things that would count as pro-social, and we kind of further categorised it into verbal and physical. So, saying something kind would be like a pro-social verbal action, or like physically sharing something or giving someone a hug, for example, would be. And so we coded and logged all of that, and then kind of counted up those incidents to turn them into quantitative data. And then in terms of bias, then what I did was made sure that 10% of the videos were double coded by somebody else, and then looked to see whether those two people agreed basically on how many incidents there'd been. And if there wasn't agreement, then that data wasn't included. So there are things like that you can do just to check that judgments, are matching up. But really, it was really important to have really clear guidance on how to code those incidents and what counted and what didn't count and so on. So a lot of kind of time was spent on creating, instructions for how to decide, which things were pro and antisocial and how to count them up.
Yeah, so things like that you don't necessarily think about when you're in practice, and you think of the effects of different kind of activities and environments on children, and that is very subjective in terms of knowing the child as well, and having that previous experience, understanding of who they are, what they do. So in your research as well, not only having different people kind of code the data, but it's also probably important to ensure that they don't know the children beforehand, so it's not necessarily like any teachers involved that work with children that code the data as well.
Yeah, so the only thing the teachers were involved in is they filled out something called a strengths and difficulties questionnaire for each child, which is something that's used quite often as kind of a screening if you're looking into whether a child might have any special educational needs or like emotional and behavioural difficulties. And the reason I asked them to do that is because when I've got all of the data, I'm interested in looking at the results in general for children as a whole, but I'm also interested in looking at, does the learning environment have a different impact on different types of children? So I wanted to know if there were children in the class who might have had existing like behaviour or emotional problems. Were they very hyperactive? Were they inattentive? Because then when I've got the data, I can look at, for example, what is the heart rate of children outdoors if they've got attention and behaviour difficulties, and how does that compare to children that don't have those difficulties, and so on. So it was useful to collect that data from the teachers. But in terms of watching the videos, no, it was a team of researchers that did that, although it did still throw up issues because, for example, as the research team that had been working with these children, we were in each class for a month or two, so we got to know the children quite well. And what we found was, for some children, what might have looked like an antisocial behaviour actually wasn't. So, for example, we might see a child come over to another one and they start to talk, and that child puts their hands over their ears and says, no, which for some children we might say, oh, that's really antisocial. They're not listening to that child, and that's quite rude. But then if we knew, for example, that child was autistic and that other child was talking too loud and it was distressing them, actually what they were doing there was really good self-regulation, put their hands over their ears to protect themselves. And so actually, in a way, that's quite pro-social, because instead of lashing out at that child, they've managed to handle the situation. So we had a lot of discussions about that, of how do we code it and what should we do? And that was difficult. But in the end, we had to code it as if we didn't know the children.
Didn't know the child. Yeah, that's really interesting, things like that, and picking it and considering what kind of remains then like objective or subjective, and there's the blurred lines there, isn't there, even with research where you are trying to be more objective and use quantitative measures.
Yeah, it is really difficult. Yeah, so you want to take account of individual children and their differences, because that's what working with children is all about. They are all different and they're all going to need slightly different things. So that is something really tricky, and I think it's where mixed methods research, where you're doing some quantitative measures and some qualitative as well, is really, really important. But obviously, the more children that you're working with, the harder it is to kind of dig down and look at those individual differences. And then the catch-22 is, if you don't have a big enough sample size, your results aren't strong enough for somebody to take them seriously. So yeah, it's difficult, and not something that, not a problem that will be solved easily, I don't think, but definitely something that's worth discussing and worth people thinking about when they're using research. You know, how is this being conducted, and how much does it take account of different children in different contexts?
Yeah, and I think, like you said, that something that we need to look at more in terms of research, and discuss more, so that we are not only producing certain findings and just looking into an area and finding out more about it, but actually thinking, how is this study and how these findings going to impact practice? Are they, like you said right at the beginning, kind of strong enough and reliable enough for people to take them seriously? And I think that is something that sometimes maybe in research we do miss, because then there's that problem of conducting research for the purpose of finding something that you want to find, or having an effect that you want to have, like I said, you know, and that in itself is not right, because then it is bias, isn't it?
Yeah,
So
it's just really important to have that two-way dialogue. So yes, we want practitioners to use research, but we also want practitioners to shape that research and be a part of forming it. So, you know, I knew I wanted to look at stress, and I wanted to look at attention, and I wanted to look at self-regulation, but I spoke to early years teachers and said, look, what will be useful for me to use? What do you actually want to know? And made sure that the measures I used were things that they were interested in. And that would be useful to them, because like I said, a lot of research out there uses things like attention tests and memory tests, but that's not what children are really doing in reception. So teachers don't want to know that. They want to know, how well do they listen to a story that I read, and can they answer questions afterwards? And you know, that was one of the attention measures that I used, actually, you know, based on that feedback from teachers. So yeah, I think it's important that it's not just, you know, teachers listening to researchers, it's that researchers need to listen to teachers too.
Yeah, definitely needs to be two ways, because a lot of research is generally conducted with older children, so the methods would then be focused on primary secondary age children, rather than early years, which is completely different. And we do need to kind of consider how to even conduct research with younger children, because it is a lot more difficult. And there's a lot more kind of ethical issues intertwined in that as well, in terms of consent too. So that's something always that we need to kind of consider a lot more in terms of early years research. It's not as straightforward as research can be with older children.
Yeah, exactly. So you know, obviously I had parent consent for all the children that took part, but you know, you have to get consent from the child as well. And some of the equipment, especially wearing the heart rate monitor, because it sticks on with these little stickers, and some of the children didn't want those on. They didn't feel comfortable having it. When you take it off, it's kind of like taking a plaster off. That sometimes feels a bit uncomfortable. So we did have quite a few children that their parents had said yes, the child said yes, but when it came to putting the equipment on, some days they would say, no, I don't want to wear it, which of course is absolutely fine. And in that situation, we didn't put the equipment on the child. But it did mean that some of the children had to be excluded from some of the analyses. So I had 75 children overall, but I only had 45 that wore the heart rate equipment consistently enough for me to in the data. And what's difficult as well is the children who are most likely to refuse wearing that equipment tend to be the children with kind of sensory processing issues maybe, or other special educational needs. Yet these are the children that are underrepresented in research already. So really want those kind of children to take part, but they can be the most challenging in terms of, you know, getting them to consent to that. So we did do lots of work around making a social story about the experiment and what it meant to take part. And we went in for lots of visits and let the children play with the equipment and familiarise them with it. So there's lots of work that can be done to kind of build that relationship and trust with the children so that they feel comfortable taking part. But again, I think it's something that researchers need to think about, because a lot of research that is done with children is done with, you know, it tends to be white middle class children without any additional needs. And we need to know more about other types of children. And again, that's why I wanted to do the research in this particular part of London. It was in Newham, where I know, Newham is one of the most ethnically diverse places in the entire country. Lots of children from deprived families and so on. So it was really important to me to do research with a different population, because especially a lot of the research that comes out of the US and so on tends to be conducted in nurseries that are part of universities. So they tend to be the children of the researchers and the scientists, which aren't necessarily representative of, the general population of children. So especially for people that are working in more challenging, areas and, with children that have got additional needs and additional challenges, we need research to represent those children too.
So that's then ensuring that you are being inclusive as a researcher, and ensuring that your research is representative of wider communities and backgrounds, but also then, like you wrote in your article, potentially then kind of looking at that disadvantage gap and considering whether outdoors does have an effect on narrowing the gap, perhaps. And then those looking at the benefits of outdoors, and if they can be kind of found in areas where there isn't as much nature, like you said, ensuring that you don't just look at forest school provision and things like that.
Yeah, so the schools that I worked in had a real range. I mean, they were all urban schools, so none of them had like fields and forests and so on, but they had a real range of outdoor areas. Some of them didn't have any nature in at all. It was literally just sort of walls around and concrete or tarmac on the floor. One of them was like a sensory garden, so it did actually have like a lawn and it had trees around. So, that's one of the analyses that I'll be doing, looking at how did the different amount of nature have an impact on children. Yeah, so the thing about the disadvantage gap is really important, because we know from existing research that children from ethnic minorities and children who are from lower income families are less likely to visit natural sites with their parents, so things like forests and parks and beaches. There's quite a bit of data on that now, but also some of the research that's out there already shows that being outdoors might have the biggest positive influence on those children. So it's possible that children who can benefit the most from being outdoors are having the least access to outdoors. So it's like a double disadvantage.
Yeah.
So that's why it's really important, if we know that not all children are having access to outdoors at home, maybe they don't have a garden, maybe their parents working really long hours and they can't take them to the park at the weekend, then that's why it's so important that in an early years setting, you're providing that equality of access, because you're then making sure that all children, no matter what's happening at the weekends or at the evenings, know they're getting their outdoor time, from their time that you're setting.
And we've kind of gone back to the beginning again, where we started in terms of research influencing practice and having that impact on educated children and parents. And that's just so vital, and what we need to always have at the forefront. So I think that's a good place to finish for our first episode, because next time we're going to be discussing how children and the teachers that you worked with reacted to your research project. I know you've mentioned it a little bit in terms of like the wearing the equipment, but it'll be interesting to hear more about that.
Right.
So thank you very much, Gemma, and I'm looking forward to hearing from you again next time.
Great. Speak to you soon.